Fanconi anemia, rare, fatal. Henry.
A child's courage in the face of a rare disease.
I am the greatest.
And a mother and father's hope in controversial medical research.
I am left with my belief system intact. I believe in love and science, nothing more, nothing less. I believe that we can't control everything, no matter how good it sounds or looks on paper. I believe it's the parents' responsibility to care for and protect their children, especially when the stakes, a chance at life, are so very high.
Henry, can I have a kiss?
Tonight, Henry's story, a lesson in the limits of what love and science can achieve.
From ABC News, this is Nightline. Reporting from Washington, Ted Koppel.
A little over 10 months ago, my colleagues Chris Bury and John Donvan brought you a story about a little boy, Henry Strongin Goldberg, who had a rare and deadly genetic disorder. The fact that Fanconi anemia is rare suggests that most of you had never heard of it before. The fact that it is deadly presupposes the outcome. Still, back in February, our story had at least a glimmer of hope. That hope lay in the remote possibility that his mother, through in vitro fertilization, could become pregnant again, and that bone marrow from this infant brother or sister would be compatible and could be used to effect a cure of what has previously been incurable. The mother tried, Lord knows how she tried, 9 times to become pregnant through in vitro fertilization. 9 times the effort failed. Ultimately, she did conceive through the natural process, giving birth about a year ago to another little boy. His bone marrow, however, was not compatible. Another bone marrow transplant was attempted from an anonymous donor. Henry's body rejected it. Throughout much of this long ordeal, Henry's father, Alan, maintained a website to keep family, friends, and those among you who cared abreast of what was happening. Last night at 7:22, Alan posted this final devastating message. At 6:40 p.m., Henry Strongin Goldberg died. I removed his breathing tube and his heart stopped beating while Laurie, his mother, held him in her arms on a rocking chair in his room. That is the end of the story. But John Donvan felt very strongly that we should use the occasion to retell the events that led up to that moment. It was a long and courageous struggle, and even though you now know that it was unsuccessful, curing what was once incurable becomes possible only through a succession of stories like Henry's.
Henry Strongin Goldberg was born in October of 1995, which makes him at this point 6 years and just a few months. And here is some of what Henry has learned about life so far. He's learned that Batman always wins and the Joker always loses. He's learned that for some reason, it's real easy to pin down his dad when they're wrestling.
Okay, big hit.
And he's observed that even when you really whack a wiffle ball, it never travels quite as far as you think it should.
Yeah!
What doesn't Henry know? He doesn't know that when he was born, the doctors said he might never reach kindergarten. Or that even with all the medicine he takes, and sometimes it puffs up his face, no medicine can yet cure the disease he has. Or that in the attempt to save his life, Henry has traveled to the edge of science, where the rules of what's morally right and morally wrong are still being written. Henry's family set course for this uncharted territory on the October day that he was born.
They handed him to us, and I had had a C-section, so they sort of handed him up to me and Alan. And when they did, the doctors and we simultaneously noticed that he had just an extra sort of joint of his right thumb. And they whisked him away to look at him more closely because that's a common genetic defect.
It wasn't just an extra thumb. Henry was born tiny, and his heart was not working properly. He would need an operation. But a genetic test showed it was much worse than that.
And so Alan called, and basically the doctor was just in shock and had just gotten the results back. And he told us that Henry had Fanconi anemia, and...
Had you ever heard of it before?
Never, no.
Fanconi anemia, named for the Swiss physician who first diagnosed it. A genetic malady that attacks children in so many different ways. The heart, cancers of the head and the neck and the mouth, and anywhere between the ages of 12 months and 12 years, the bone marrow fails, which means the chances of acute leukemia suddenly increase 40,000 times. Fanconi anemia, in short, is a child killer. And in a journal that Laurie began keeping, she admitted to herself that her baby boy, Henry, was in the worst sort of trouble.
Fanconi anemia, rare, fatal, Henry. I'm sad. I don't feel sad. I am sad. And it's real, and it's forever. Now what do we do?
Family photos and home movies from early in Henry's life.
Here we are at our first Thanksgiving with our new little son.
I would say probably the best coping mechanism is being around Henry. Because Henry is just amazing. And you cannot be sad around him. You can't, be angry about the hand we've been dealt when you're around him, because he has that sunny disposition all the time. Henry, can I have a kiss?
But still, that first year, Alan and Laurie had to see their baby put through open heart surgery.
There are tubes coming out everywhere. They're swollen. They're catatonic. It's pretty scary.
But what's remarkable about kids this age is how quickly they can recover from something like a heart operation. Henry spent less than 2 weeks in the hospital.
So 5 more days in the step-down unit, and then we were home, and it was like nothing happened. He was totally fine.
And then he was, again, back to being a normal kid. Didn't get sick. He was fine. Keep him up there like that. Yeah.
And that is one of the things about Henry. For most of his life, other than the fact that he is decidedly smaller than other kids his age, even his younger brother Jack is gaining on him, he's looked and felt like a kid with nothing especially wrong with him. But there was always a clock ticking in his parents' head. They knew that unless something were done, leukemia was inevitable, which meant Henry would not live out his childhood.
Everybody, try to get it!
And then they heard that maybe there was a way, after all, to save Henry.
For us, it was the silver bullet. It solved all of our problems. It was like it gave our family a future together, basically.
All they knew at that point was that a new medical technology was offering another hope for Henry's life. It would also be complicated, costly, and controversial.
This is ABC News Nightline, brought to you by GMC.
Okay, this is the slow one, okay?
This summer, around the time we first began videotaping scenes of Henry and his family, and September 11th was still in the future, the weightiest decision before the president was whether to support stem cell research that would require destroying human embryos. One of the key questions, as the president put it, is whether it is morally acceptable to regard human life as something you make use of.
First, are these frozen embryos human life and therefore something precious to be protected? And second, if they're going to be destroyed anyway, shouldn't they be used for a greater good, for research that has the potential to save and improve other lives?
In the midst of this debate, which dominated the news in the pre-September 11th world, Henry's father, Alan, published an article in the New York Times calling for more research and expressing his gratitude for past research on human embryos. And when you hear the next part of Henry's story, you can understand why his parents were willing to go as far as science could take them. Because Alan and Laurie, in an effort to help Henry, had already embarked on a path that involved, some would say, making use of a human life. They saw it not as some abstract ethical issue, but simply as their best shot at saving their son's life. And it was this. While Henry was passing his 3rd birthday and his 4th and approaching his 5th, his parents knew the day was approaching when leukemia was likely to set in. The only known treatment was a bone marrow transplant, and the best hope for that to work was to find a bone marrow donor who was a close genetic match for Henry. Now, Henry's life at this point was already a constant series of visits to the doctor.
Does it hurt when I press right there? Okay.
And it was through a medical contact that Alan and Lori got the idea of conceiving another child whose umbilical cord blood could be used for Henry's bone marrow transplant. And they learned they now had this option because of a relatively new technique for screening embryos called PGD, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. PGD is a way to screen embryos for genetic problems. Combined with some other tests, it meant this for Henry's parents. They could now determine whether an embryo they conceived was both a good match for a bone marrow transplant and was also free of Henry's disease. In other words, they could now conceive and know from the start whether an embryo had what Henry needed. And though Alan and Lori were not infertile, they had Henry naturally and his little brother Jack, they now proceeded on a crash program of in vitro fertilization, creating embryos in a petri dish, as many as they could, to improve the odds. Again, from Lori's journal.
Our plan was to do in vitro fertilization, during which I would make 15 to 20 eggs, all of which would be fertilized with Alan's sperm. Of these, our hope was that at least 3 would be healthy or free of Fanconi anemia and perfect genetic matches for Henry, and therefore a bone marrow donor. It feels strange describing them this way, because what they are potential new additions to the Strongin Goldberg clan. Children who we would love, just like Jack and Henry, who would have needs, wishes, desires.
So everything began to hinge on your being able to conceive another child who, number 1, did not have Fanconi, and number 2, who would be a match for Henry so that you could use his basically umbilical cord, placental material,
Right.
for a bone marrow transplant.
Which it's important to say is something that they normally, after delivery, throw away. It is medical waste.
You know, I think some viewers will look at what you're doing and say, well, you were trying to have a child serve as a cure for your older boy's illness. What is your response to that?
This just happened to be a way to have a child who we knew would be healthy and not have to face what Henry had faced. And I think it's of value to Jack and to, you know, whatever baby might have been produced through this process, to be born into a family that did not suffer such a tremendous loss. That's good for that child. This is not just something that's only good for Henry. It's good for our whole family. People have babies for lots of different reasons. Having one that would be able to survive and also, you know, essentially cure an older sibling of a fatal disease seems like pretty up on the top of the list of good reasons to have a baby, to me. You know.
Yeah, I feel that we're fortunate that the technology exists.
Besides, they say, they had always planned on adding to their family. But this method was never a sure thing, and it was anything but easy.
You can't do it if you don't think it's going to work.
Why?
It's too hard.
How hard is it?
So hard. It's so hard that it's hard to remember how hard it is.
The injections beat up Lori's body. Her trips to the clinic in New York split up her family. The rise and fall and rise of their hopes wore everyone out.
And you did it 9 times altogether?
9 times. So, I mean, I think in the end I actually counted, and I had 353 shots over a period of 3 years. Every shot you're thinking, this is life or death. Every visit to the doctor, you're thinking, this is life or death.
You mean Henry's life?
Henry's life or death.
Late last year, a breakthrough. It was all over the news that the process Henry's parents were using had worked in another family.
In a Minneapolis hospital today, a 6-year-old girl is recovering from a transplant of new cells which may save her life.
Henry's parents knew this family and were happy for them, but at the same time, they were discouraged. 9 times Lori and Alan had tried in vitro fertilization. They had produced 198 eggs, created more than 100 fertilized embryos, but only a handful were the right match for Henry, and of those, not a single one survived after being implanted in Lori's womb. Her journal on just one of those occasions.
I was sick of feeling sick and tired. I was sick of being away from my husband and children. I was sick of having my hopes up and then dashed. I was sick of the whole damn thing. I looked Alan in the eye and I said, face it, this is never, ever, ever going to work.
What kept going wrong?
Certainly not the egg production. I mean, I think that one doctor called it sort of like the Goldberg curse or something. But I don't know. I think what it all came down to was pretty much bad luck.
In spring of 2000, Henry was getting sick more often. If he were going to have a bone marrow transplant, it would have to be right away, with a stranger's bone marrow, with no sibling to save him.
Behind me.
Okay, kiddo. Okay. I'm gonna borrow that arm one more time. I am the greatest.
2 summers ago, with his parents still trying to create a child whose umbilical cord blood could be used to save him, Henry's blood platelet count had dropped to less than 10,000, which is very dangerous. He had developed a major infection and a raging fever. It was time to change strategy.
Our transplant doctor advised us that time had run out and that it would be too great a risk to wait any longer.
So they abandoned their efforts to give birth to a genetic match for Henry and went to the University of Minnesota, the Fairview University Medical Center, to get Henry a transplant using the bone marrow of a stranger as closely matched to Henry as possible.
Batmobile, drive, now, round!
It was a terribly rough time for a little boy and for his parents who had to watch his hair fall out from the chemotherapy, and the vomiting, and the diarrhea, and the mouth sores.
That's my wish, and the wish came true.
Okay, and what are you going to get at the Batman store? Why don't you sing about what you...
Very often, it's the bone marrow transplant itself that kills a child because it so weakens his immune system. Henry has had plenty of close calls, plenty of serious infections.
He's also had a number of infections that have been very difficult to identify and to treat. What we have done is had a number of procedures, invasive procedures, including a biopsy of Henry's brain, a biopsy of his liver, and a biopsy of his lungs to try and identify the infection that has been bedeviling the doctors and Henry.
Henry's life is still lived in and out of doctors' offices, and he's got remarkable spirit.
Okay, Henry, breathe in.
Breathe in.
Breathe out.
They scan him.
All the way up to the ceiling.
They stretch him.
Okay, I'm going to turn the lights down.
They look in his eyes.
Go.
They run him down the hall.
Okay.
And yet, if you look at Henry today...
It's an indoor stadium. Is that neat?
My God.
Is that neat?
This was when he got in to see the Minnesota Twins in batting practice last summer. He's obviously still kicking, and then some.
A baseball player.
You want to be a baseball player?
In fact, a whole lot.
Oh, my God.
But not everyone agrees with what they tried to do. This summer, Henry's story appeared in the New York Times Sunday magazine. One reader wrote, "It seems like a mental illness has overcome these parents, and saving a genetically defective, not savable child has taken over decency, reason, and all sense of morality."
What's your response to that?
Look at these pictures behind us. People who question why we're doing this, they can't possibly understand, I don't think, the extent to which we love Henry and Jack and want to retain our family's integrity, and also just the high quality of life that they're living, that, you know, we're hoping is only going to get better.
When you hear the argument made about the research, that it's really violating just the sanctity of human life to be fooling around with embryos. What's your response to that?
That's not my child, that is. I mean, you cannot even see what those people are talking about with the naked eye. My own personal definition of life is not the 4 cells sitting in a cold petri dish somewhere. That's my definition of life.
Henry's future remains uncertain. His transplant may head off leukemia, but it does not cure Fanconi anemia, which tends to bring on other cancers later in childhood or in the teen years. His parents believe their only choice is to hope that someone will find a cure by then.
I am left with my belief system intact. I believe in love and science, nothing more, nothing less. I believe that we can't control everything, no matter how good it sounds or looks on paper. I believe it's the parents' responsibility to care for and protect their children, especially when the stakes, a chance at life, are so very high.
I'm John Donvan for Nightline in Washington.
I'll be back in a moment with a brief final note.
To receive a daily email about each evening's Nightline and a preview of special broadcasts, log on to the Nightline page at abcnews.com.
As most of you now know, Henry Strongin Goldberg died last night at the age of 7 years, 2 months. That's our report for tonight. I'm Ted Koppel in Washington. I hope we'll see you shortly on Up Close.
This has been a presentation of ABC News. More Americans get their news from ABC News than from any other source. ABC News, now traveling to all 50 states in 50 weeks in search of America.